Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Barbara Krauthammer, Dean of the College of Humanities and Fine Arts and Professor of History at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm so pleased to welcome you all tonight, and I'd like to begin our event by acknowledging that our university community stands on Nonotuck land. And I'd also like to acknowledge our neighboring Indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. Tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our keynote lecture by the distinguished scholar and the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer. Tonight's lecture launches the Creative Women Leading Climate Action, a free virtual event series that runs through October 15th. This symposium is focused on building awareness and participation in finding creative solutions to the climate crisis. And it includes performance premieres, panel discussions, and other opportunities to collaborate and create new works. It emerges from our belief that the arts have a unique and powerful role in addressing the climate crisis. Tonight's lecture is also the keynote event and first event of the 2020-2021 Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series. The Feinberg Series is offered every other year by the Department of History at UMass Amherst, thanks to the generosity of our alumnus, Kenneth Feinberg and Associates. Each iteration of the series features a focus on a big issue, a topic of clear and compelling concern to society. Each series features a wide variety of events, including lectures, exhibitions, performances, panel discussions, and films, all of which invite our audiences to consider historical context, analysis, and individual and collective experiences to better understand the topic at hand. This year's Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series is titled Planet on a Precipice, Histories and Futures of Environmental Emergency. It seeks to deepen our understanding of the environmental emergency through historical analysis, and in so doing, help us understand and envision constructive paths forward. For more information about both of these series and to register for future events, please look for the links to their websites in the chat box. Before we get started, I want to thank the more than 6 community and university groups that partnered to make these initiatives possible. We will share information about our partners in the chat box now. Some of our partners are here tonight, and they will be facilitating discussion groups from 7:30 to 8 p.m. And I warmly welcome everyone to join them. We also encourage you to look at the chat for information about how to turn on live closed captioning or to listen to this event in Spanish. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Professor Christine DeLucia, a scholar of Indigenous history and a member of the faculty at Williams College. She is the author of the award-winning book Memory Lands and is a distinguished scholar, writer, and teacher. Professor DeLucia's teaching and writing explore the stories we tell about history and how accounts of the past can assist us in creating a more just and sustainable future for humans and for the earth. So now, please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Professor Christine DeLucia.
Thank you so much. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that tonight I am speaking with you from the homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation and would like to acknowledge their ongoing caretaking for their homelands. At the end of Dr. Kimmerer's talk, I will be organizing the flow of questions and would invite everyone who's attending to submit questions through either the Zoom Q&A feature or through a Google form that will be shared. It is my deep pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer for this evening's presentation. Dr. Kimmerer's writing and life work have been profound inspirations to readers and communities both locally and across the globe. She brings forward stories about human beings' relationships with plants, trees, and many additional other than human lives. Focusing on forms of Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, as well as scientific knowledge, she maps out very old as well as present day relationships with the earth and considers how all of us might live out more ethical futures. Dr. Kimmerer is of European and Anishinaabe ancestry and is an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. She is the SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York. She serves as the founding director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. Dr. Kimmerer is the author of numerous scientific articles and of the book Gathering Moss, A Natural and Cultural History of Mosses, which was awarded the John Burroughs Medal for nature writing. It offers a detailed consideration of how these extremely ancient forms of life have maintained such resilience and tenacity. Dr. Kimmerer followed Gathering Moss with a second book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. Braiding Sweetgrass, which I think many of us tonight have read, has been described as a word-of-mouth sensation, selling nearly 500,000 copies worldwide, ascending the New York Times bestseller list as well. It has undergone many printings and been translated into multiple global languages. I think the reception of Braiding Sweetgrass tells us a great deal about the relevance, urgency, and beauty of the stories Dr. Kimmerer has worked so carefully to understand. Her book frankly acknowledges the difficult environmental and social circumstances of the early 21st century and how extractive, profit-oriented worldviews have caused enormous harm to living beings. Yet she moves well beyond that critique to offer a set of personal and place-based touchstones to reorient us. Drawing upon specific Indigenous contexts and knowledge systems, she explores what she calls original instructions. These are, she emphasizes, quote, like a compass. They provide an orientation but not a map. The work of living is creating that map for yourself. Weaving together core concepts about reciprocity, gift exchange, animacy, kinship, and the rights of nature, Dr. Kimmerer invites each of us to reflect on our webs of relations, our obligations, and our possibilities for bringing about more just and sustainable ways of living. I wanted to share a quotation from a recent interview she did with The Guardian. She said, quote, "I don't have the power to dismantle Monsanto, but what I do have is the capacity to change how I live on a daily basis and how I think about the world. When we change how we think, we suddenly change how we act and how those around us act, and that's how the world changes." Perhaps the most direct testament I can offer about the impact of Braiding Sweetgrass is that when I have taught this book in my college classes, the response from students has been extraordinarily engaged. It's a book that pulls readers in to the hard work of learning and transforming. It plants seeds and continues to bear fruit long after we have closed its pages. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Bonjour, Jayak. Thank you, Christine, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm really glad to hear the way in which Braiding Sweetgrass has resonated with your students. I want to begin in my beautiful Potawatomi language to say bonjour, Shrabadas Gegish Kokwena Desnakas, Bodwe Wadmi Kwenda, Megazedo dem, Minwa Makodo dem, Shishibanyak Nebendagwas, Syracuse, New York, Nedoch Bia. I don't speak very much of my Potawatomi language, but it is an endangered species, and our teachers ask us to speak it and breathe life into it whenever we have an opportunity. And in my language, I gave you respectful greetings and told you that I am a Potawatomi Anishinaabe woman of the Bear Clan and also of the Eagles enrolled in Citizen Potawatomi Nation in Shawnee, Oklahoma. I'm going to share my screen now. I have lots of slides because here we are on a beautiful September evening when we really want and should be outside engaged with all those other beings. So I want to bring them to us with photographs. Let me see if I can. There we go. Hopefully, yeah, there we go. All right. So I would say another part of our traditional protocol is to always begin with gratitude. So miigwech to one another as people for the privilege of being in one another's company tonight, for this beautiful day, that we are whole and healthy and surrounded by the companionship of maples and geese. I offer my gratitude for the Onondaga people in whose homelands I reside and to whom we owe an unpaid debt of land and history and knowledge. Gratitude for the gifts of the earth with which we are showered every day. And is my slide not advancing? There we go. Here, let me see if I can. There we go. You see berries now? Good, alrighty. Much of the society that we live in speak of these everyday miracles as natural resources. I really can't deal with that word, as if berries and gifts were our property, you know, just waiting to be transformed. In the ecological sciences, we call them ecosystem services, as if they were somehow the inevitable outcomes of the ecological machine. But to traditional people and to me, simply as a human person filling my basket with berries, they feel like gifts from the other species, the more than human beings who surround us. And though every one of us lives in this beautiful world made of gifts, we find ourselves harnessed to institutions and, of course, to an economy that relentlessly asks us, what more can we take from the earth? But isn't the question we need, what does the earth ask of us? And it is this question that drives my presentation tonight. I also want to say how grateful I am to the organizers of this wonderful series, particularly the creative women leading climate change. And I've been especially moved by the powerful voices of women and Indigenous women. And I'm mindful that in the Potawatomi way, women are honored as the life givers. Those are the people who are bringing the world back into balance, caring for the other life givers among us, the waters, Mother Earth, and the plants. And in my words this evening, I want to especially invoke the wisdom of women. We are in an era when women's voices and the voices of marginalized peoples are rising and will lead the way to a just transition in the face of climate chaos. In that spirit, I want to invoke the teachings of our mythic first woman, Gij Kokwe, the Sky Woman, and offer her gratitude, respect, and reciprocity. I don't have time this evening to share this story so that I can share others, but know that Sky Woman, the Sky Woman falling to the earth, has become the symbol of our Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, with the permission of the Oneida artist, the late Bruce King. And her reciprocity as a co-creator of the world brings us to remember the other goal of our Center for Native Peoples is to see with both eyes, to learn to see both with Western science in which many of us are embedded and with Indigenous knowledge and wisdom. Now, it seems to me that in the past couple of centuries, which honestly is just an eye blink in the lifetime of our species, we have been doing an unintended experiment with very real manifestations. It's like we've been doing an experiment to say, what would happen if? What would happen if we believed in this pyramid that you see right here, the pyramid of human exceptionalism? What if a single species out of the millions which inhabit the planet was somehow more deserving of the richness of the earth than any other? And not only that, that in this experiment of the last few centuries, all the ecological laws which constrain growth and consumption somehow don't apply to us, that the laws of thermodynamics have been repealed on our behalf. The experiment tests the hypothesis. What would happen if we behaved as if the earth was nothing more than stuff, a strictly materialist, utilitarian view of the earth. And moreover, that all that stuff belonged to us. Well, the results of that experiment are in, aren't they? We see them all around us. The title of your series, Planet on the Precipice. We find ourselves teetering at the edge of that precipice of climate chaos, entering what evolutionary biologists have called the age of the sixth extinction, in which we are losing 200 species every day. What does the earth ask of us? The earth asks us to change. And yet, so much of our environmental discourse is all about changing policy and changing technology, changing light bulbs, as it were. And don't get me wrong, new technologies will be an important response. But as a scientist and as an artist, I don't think that it's only new technology that we need. If we are to survive, and if our more than human relatives are to survive with us, we need to change more than light bulbs. We need a change in worldview. From a worldview that thinks about land as rights, as property, capital, natural resources, and ecosystem services, to land as home, land as identity, as sustainer, as the residence of our more than human relatives, our connection to ancestors, land as a library of knowledge, land as a pharmacy, our healer, land as inspirited, land as home, land not as the place for which we somehow claim rights, but land as the place for which we have moral responsibility, and land as sacred. I think we are living in an era of profound error. For much of the human's time on the planet before this great delusion, we lived in cultures that understood ourselves not as masters of the universe at the top of that pyramid, but as the younger brothers of creation. And that scientific worldview that has so dominated our landscape like a monoculture for the past 500 years has certainly given us tremendous gains in the quality of human life, without question. Huge advances in knowledge. But it's not more knowledge that we need in this moment, I think. It's more wisdom. And generating wisdom is simply not within the purview of science alone. We need a science that draws on mind, body, emotion, and spirit. We need traditional ecological knowledge, which is based on the recognition that we humans are not atop a pyramid of life, but are just one member of a democracy of species governed by laws of interdependence. And you know, this time on the precipice and the choices that face us was spoken of by our ancestors in the teachings known as the prophecies of the seventh fire. A long story, an important one, and I'll share just a tiny fragment of that story this evening. The seven fires refer to historical eras in our people's history, including our migration from the mouth of the St. Lawrence to our current homelands in the Great Lakes. Each fire is an era in history, both of tragedy and courageous resilience. After the arrival of the newcomers and after all the losses arising from colonialism and attempted genocide, the loss of land, of language, of sacred ways, of each other. It's said that after all of that, the people will find themselves in a time when you can no longer fill a cup from stream and drink, when the air is too thick to breathe, and when the plants and animals themselves will begin to turn their faces away from us. It is said that in that time, we will know as the time of the seventh fire. And we know that that is the situation in which we find ourselves. It is said that in this time, all of the world's people, both the original peoples and the newcomers together, are going to stand at a fork in the road. And in my imagination, one of the paths on that fork is soft and green and spangled with dew. You could walk barefoot there. And one of the paths is burnt and black. It's made of cinders that would cut your feet. And the prophecy tells us that we must make a choice between the path of materialism and greed that will destroy the earth, or the spiritual path of care and compassion, of B'madaziwin, the path of good life. And we know what we want, but we're told that we can't just walk forward down that green path. The people of the seventh fire must instead walk backwards and pick up what was left for us along the ancestors' path. The stories, the teachings, the songs are more than human relatives who were lost along the way, and our language. And when we have found these again and placed them in our bundles, the things that will heal us, only then can we walk together forward on that green path. And these are the questions that we face today at this fork in the road. What do we find along the ancestors' path that will heal us and bring us back to balance? What do each of us love too much to lose, that we will pick it up and carry it through the narrows of climate change safely to the other side? These are the questions we must be asking ourselves. Indeed, we must be asking each other and our leaders. For there is another side. The prophecy teaches us that the people of the seventh fire are going to need great courage, creativity, and wisdom, but that the people of the seventh fire will lead us to the lighting of the eighth fire. It said that we, you and me, we are the people of the seventh fire. And to make that transformation, one of the things that we have to pick up along the ancestor path are the stories, some of which I'll share with you this evening. Faced with the problems that we have created, I don't know about you, but there are a lot of times when I long for a teacher for this time. I wish there was a wise grandma who could guide us in this perilous time to find the good path. And again, we invoke Sky Woman, the first woman, and what were her teachings of reciprocity, respect, and reverence for the living world that might guide us. Our ancient stories tell us that when Sky Woman went back to the sky, she now looks over all of us with the visage of Nokmes de Bakyesis, our grandmother moon. And I think that grandmother moon, that Sky Woman, left our teachers behind for us, the ones that she brought to us, the plants. And in many indigenous traditions, plants are understood not only as persons, but as among our oldest teachers. They have been on the earth far longer than we have, and they embody the virtues that we honor. Who better to look to for guidance than those who can take light and air and water, they turn it into food, and then they give it away? Who makes medicines and distributes them for free? Their numbers include the oldest, the largest, the most powerful of our relatives. We might do well to look to them for guidance. And when I'm wrestling with a question, I often go to them for counsel to see what the plants have to say about it. How do we listen? How do they speak to us? What if you were a teacher, a keeper of great knowledge, but you had no voice to speak it, you had no pen to write it, and there was something that you needed to say? Plants tell their stories not by what they say, but by what they do. And the name for plants in our language, Anishnaabemowin, reminds us of this, The plants are called mishkikin, the medicines. And when we take that word mishkikin apart, it means the strength of the earth. And in this year, which is the warmest ever recorded, when the glaciers are melting, storms are rising, hundreds of our fellow species are in grave danger, it's important to remember that we don't have to figure this out by ourselves. We have our teachers. In the Indigenous paradigm, knowledge arises from multiple sources. One of those hallmarks of Indigenous knowledge is learning from the land by listening to these intelligences other than our own. And this is grounded in the understanding of the personhood of all beings and the intelligence of the living world. Forward-thinking scientists have a parallel in this so-called new area of study based on accessing the intelligence of nature for design, environmental engineering, and problem solving. And of course, you know, this new discipline is called biomimicry, the idea that we could learn from the living world how nature has evolved solutions to life, and then adopting those solutions for our own questions. Pretty predictably, the science of biomimicry is, in many cases, restricted to learning what new products we might make. What interests me, though, is what they might teach us about how we could live. And my dear friend, Jeff Greeno, a plant knowledge holder of the Menominee Nation, puts it this way. He says, the elder plants carry the knowledge that we need to survive. And so if plants are our teachers in this time of crisis, what do they teach us about responses to climate change? If we were willing to listen and learn from them. Plants know what to do about climate change. They're not dithering in ineffectual meetings and debating carbon tax structures. They just get to work. They can be a model for the transformation we need. And think about it. They've already converted completely to a solar economy. You've probably heard that entrepreneur Richard Branson has established the Virgin Earth Challenge to spur the design of new technologies which would remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it while we are transforming to a fossil fuel-free economy. It's a lofty goal. Critical deployment of human creativity on behalf of the climate, and the prize is $25 million. Human ingenuity can certainly be part of the solution, but we should keep in mind that there's already a system that pulls carbon from the atmosphere and stores it for centuries. It has even more bells and whistles. It generates oxygen. It builds soil, it protects biodiversity, purifies water at the same time, and it makes us feel happy and peaceful. It's called a forest. I say, give the Branson Prize to the trees. After all, plants don't put out CO2 into the atmosphere. They take it out of the atmosphere and sequester it in long-term storage of biomass, in the bodies of tree trunks, in 12-foot deep roots of prairie grass, in the bogs of peat, in the organic matter of rich, fertile soils. Because after all, what are coal and oil but the stored carbon of prehistoric plants? The plants stored away all that carbon, kept it out of the atmosphere, until we decided to rip open the earth and burn up eons of stored fossil carbon in just a few centuries. Plants have been sequestering carbon since the beginning. Let's follow their lead and join the movement to keep it in the ground. What do plants do when the climate changes? They grow faster when there's more CO2 through the so-called CO2 fertilization effect. But as hard as they might try, that doesn't get us there, because as the plants grow full tilt, they soon run out of other things like nutrients and water and soil, which are in ever shorter supply. Plants don't degrade the soil, they build it. Plants don't degrade water, they purify it. And when we stand in a shower of spring rain, we have the plants to thank for that. Cut down enough forest and the rain will disappear. Plants save the water. As the world heats up, who is it that creates oases of shade? Who cools our cities' urban heat islands? But the trees, doing sophisticated air conditioning without using a single watt of electricity. They don't ruin the land, they heal it. They are our teachers of restoration. Animals respond to climate change by moving, if they can, to more favorable climates, if they still exist. But the plants can't do that. It takes much longer for rooted beings to move. So they adapt in place. Under conditions of stress, many plants will accelerate their growth, their sexual reproduction even. They mix up their genes. They make lots of seeds of many kinds. Plants become the anti-Monsanto. They create and harbor genetic diversity instead of diminishing it, especially with the partnership of native farmers. The sad truth, though, is that the carbon budget models tell us quite clearly that we are already past the point when we can rely entirely on these natural solutions of forests and plants to reestablish the carbon dioxide balance, even if we could protect, restore, and invigorate them. We've simply added way too much carbon to the atmosphere and cut down too many forests, so that in the short term, we have crippled the plant's ability to respond, which is why the plants can't do this alone. They need us. All of these solutions in nature's inherent capacity to halt deforestation, reforest, ecological restoration, wetland protection, regenerative agriculture, all of these plants are part of these solutions. And even, of course, we as individuals are part of the solution. But we all know that our individual acts of reducing our carbon footprints are a small fraction of the carbon emissions from institutions and from industry, fed by our federally subsidized reliance on fossil fuels, fed by an economy that incentivizes destruction of land for private gain over the common good. It's time to imagine and implement a new green economy from the future, because nature's solutions are no longer enough until we heal the land. What we need, as we know, is system change, not climate change. All of these solutions, from the individual to the institutional, are of utmost importance. And collectively, we as human people standing on the side of forests and the land have to do our part to raise a garden and to raise a ruckus. And in this particular year, this pivotal election, which will determine the future, whether we can take that green path or not, lies in our hands. While we do that, trying to head down that green path, we have to remember the teaching of the seventh fire prophecy that we turn around first and pick up what was left for us, that we go in a good way down that green path. And we could do worse than to listen to traditional indigenous philosophies of learning from the plants. So the important question is, especially to all of us who consider ourselves students, and I hope that's everybody, we are always students. If the plants are our oldest teachers, how can we be better students? How can we learn and listen to the plants? For one, like all good students, we have to pay attention. How do we do that? There's so many ways. Art is a way of paying attention. Science is a way of paying attention. So many ways. And you know, ethnobotanists tell us that our grandparents knew over 100 different plants by name and by use. And of course, our ancestors knew many more than that. Of course they did, because they grew them in their gardens and picked them in the woods in a time when people understood that food comes from the earth, not just from the grocery store. But today, the average American can identify 100 different corporate logos and only 10 plants. Is it any wonder that we live in a society that recognizes legal personhood for corporations and no legal standing at all for birch trees or for blue jays? Here is a powerful need for system change when corporations are granted the rights of personhood, but living beings are not. We have to get to work on that. Knowing the beings with whom we share the world by paying attention is also the pathway to recognition of the world as gift. The world seems less like a shopping bag of commodities and more like a gift when you know the one who gives you the aspirin for your headache. Her name's Willow. She lives up by the pond. She's a neighbor to Maple, who offers you the gift of syrup on your Sunday morning pancakes. Paying attention is a pathway to gratitude and to reciprocity. Naming plants and our other non or more than human relatives is not just a matter of respect. It can also be a powerful tool for transformation. Recognition of personhood for all beings opens the door to ecological justice. Our laws today are all about governing our rights to the land. The shift we need is to include the rights of the land to be whole and healthy, and the simple right to exist. There we go. If we engage our indigenous teachings, which regard all living beings as persons, we can follow the lead of our Maori brothers and sisters who have worked to have their sacred river declared a person, or to the indigenous-led nations of Ecuador and Bolivia who have enshrined the rights of nature in their constitutions, to the global movement, which is led by indigenous philosophy, manifest in the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Nature, which is currently before the United Nations, where I had the privilege of speaking in support of several years ago. It's at the Paris climate talks where the first tribunal for rights of nature were held. Among the teachings, the seventh fire teachings of Native peoples is an antidote to disrespect for the land, medicine for our broken relationship with the earth that we might pick up along that seventh fire path. It's a code of ethics and practice which guides how it is that we take from the earth. Because we can't say we will not take from the earth. We're animals, we're consumers, we're heterotrophs. We're unable to photosynthesize, so we must take from the earth, but how we do so is critically important. And collectively, the indigenous canon of principles and practices that govern this exchange of one life for another is known as the honorable harvest. These are rules of sorts that govern our taking, so that the world is as rich for the seventh generation as it is for us. These rules are simultaneously biophysical, or ecological, we might say, and spiritual. And in the indigenous worldview, those realms are mutually reinforcing, not mutually exclusive. The guidelines for the honorable harvest were taught to me by generous teachers. It was taught to me in picking medicines, and how to pick berries, how to cut firewood, how to collect, gather any gifts from the land. And it applies to every single exchange between people and the earth. And this protocol for the honorable harvest is not really written down, but if it is, it would look something like this. Let's start at the beginning here of never take the first one. If you were going berry picking or to gather medicine or food, you just don't start grabbing everything in sight. We are taught to never take the first, because that means you'll never take the last. This is a prescription which has inherent conservation value through the practice of self-restraint. And then if we do encounter a second or a fourth or a seventh, we ask permission. I've been taught to address that plant, to introduce myself, to give greetings and thanks, and explain what my need is. If you're going to take a life, you have to be personally accountable. And I know there are places where if you saw me talking to a plant in the woods, they'd call you crazy. But in a worldview that regards them as people, we just call it respect. And it's a two-way conversation, because if you're going to ask, you have to listen for the answer. And you can listen in different ways. You can look around and see whether the plants are healthy and numerous enough, whether they have enough to share. And if their answer is no, you just go home empty-handed, because we have to remember they don't belong to us. They're not our property. Taking without permission is also known as stealing. If you are granted permission, then take only what you need and no more. And this is so difficult in our affluence-plagued society, where the difference between wants and needs gets so easily blurred. The honorable harvest also counsels that we take in such a way that does the least harm, and if possible, to take in a way that benefits the growth of the plant. The maxim that was given me is, don't use a shovel if a digging stick will do. And whatever you have harvested, use every last bit of it. It's disrespectful of the life that was given to you to waste it. And we have forgotten that the easiest way to have everything that you need is not to waste what you have. The honorable harvest reminds us of our responsibility for gratitude, to give thanks for what we have received. And in an economy which urges us to always want more, the practice of gratitude is truly a radical act. Thankfulness for all that is given makes you feel rich, rich beyond measure, where wealth is counted as having enough to share. Now, gratitude may seem like weak tea given the desperate challenges that lie before us, but it's powerful medicine, much more than a simple thank you. It's an antidote to the arrogance of our time. It reminds us that we're one member of the democracy of species. It reminds us that the earth does not belong to us. The next tenet is to share it with others, human and non, just as the plants shared generously with us, so we have to model that behavior in return. And then to reciprocate the gift. In order for balance to occur, we can't take without giving back. Plant gatherers often leave a spiritual gift behind, also a material gift. Maybe through weeding or spreading seeds or breaking up rhizomes and replanting them. We give care, we give gratitude, we give ceremony, we give our attention, our respect. The list is long. Now, I am told that there is a teaching even older than the honorable harvest, and that is to take only that which is given to you. And this is a pretty challenging ethical and ecological concept, to be able to discern what is given to us as opposed to what we take under duress. I continue to wrestle with this concept. I am not close to full understanding, but I do know that coal from mountaintop removal is not given to us, that tar sands oil that destroys the land is not given to us, shale gas that from hydrofracking that poisons water so we can have more things to throw away is not given to us. But every day the sun's energy is given to us, Every day the wind blows and the surf rolls without impediment. They are freely given to us and limitless in supply, although not without their own cost, to be sure. Take only that which is given is a key part of a sustainable energy policy. Think about it. How do we apply the honorable harvest in contemporary times? Had we been living by the honorable harvest, had we taken only that which was given to us, perhaps we would not today be threatened by our own atmosphere. Can we extend the concept of the honorable harvest to address the environmental dilemmas that we face today? We need acts of restoration, not only for polluted waters and degraded lands. We need a restoration of honor to the way that we live. And the reward is not just a feel-good sense of responsibility, although there's that, but it may save our lives. Our economies and institutions enmesh most of us in a profoundly dishonorable harvest. Collectively, by assent or by inaction, we have chosen the policies we live by, and we can choose again. We can choose reciprocity to sustain the lives that sustain our own. This is the teaching of the plants. Think of it. These amazing plant teachers, brilliant, gentle, wise, creative, sacred beings who give and give. They are trying their best. They are doing their best to save the world against human folly, trying to hold it all together until the industrial society grows out of its destructive adolescence and grows into wisdom. They are making forests, soils, food, medicine, home for all beings, trying to hold back climate change. And instead of showering them with gratitude and respect that they are owed, we cut them down, dig them up, enslave them, poison them in an act of betrayal so profound it threatens the continuity of life. What do you suppose it will be like at that moment when people wake up and realize that we have ground our oldest teachers underfoot? With that question, I'm going to leave you this evening with a story that I return to again and again for hope and courage in a time of crisis. I first heard this story from Haudenosaunee elder Tom Porter, sitting at his kitchen table at Gonajohalege when he pulled out a deerskin bag of stones, when he told me about the time when Sky Woman's grandsons, the twins, were in conflict over the future of the beautiful world, about how the struggle between the twin forces of creation and destruction, forces which are always with us, were at last to be decided in a game. To decide the fate of the world, the twins decided to match their skills at what we know today as the Peachstone game. The players use a set of so-called stones, which are usually peach pits or plum stones, painted black on one side and white on the other. The player shakes the bowl, tosses the stones into the air, and only when all the stones have turned one way or the other is a winner declared and the fate of life decided. If all of the stones came up black, flint would prevail and destruction would be loosed upon the world. Should they all fall white, then the world would continue under the generous hand of creation. They played and played without a winner. They tossed the seeds for hours back and forth, and with every throw, two boys gambled with the future of the world. Would life continue as we know it, or would all be lost? It's such an ancient story, and yet could not feel more contemporary. as we are today gambling with the future of the earth, with the continuity of life. On and on the boys played. They played all night until the glimmer of light at the eastern horizon warned them that time was nearly up. They could make only one more throw. As the pink of dawn colored their faces, the stones flew into the air for the last time and began to clatter one by one into the bowl. The first one came up black, and the next, and the next, and the next. All the stones were black until there was only a single seed still hanging in the air, tumbling and spinning on its way to the bowl to join the others. All the other beings on earth watched in terror as humans gambled with the continuation of life. And at the moment when all life hung in the balance, it said that all the members of creation, the trees, the berries, the grasses, the birds, the four-legged, the many-legged, and the no-legged, all drew in their breaths as that last stone tumbled, and together all of creation gave a mighty shout. Its force caused the human foolishness to be overruled, and the power of their joined voices turned that last stone over as it fell into the dish. It fell the color of trillium blooming in spring, mother's milk of moonlit snow, the color of a polar bear. I've tried to imagine the sound of that shout, the roars, the panting, the swishing of grasses. And in my imagination, I feel rather than hear their voices, loud and large and small, chirps, hoots, buzzes, howls and flutters, scrapes, squeaks, leaf flutters, needle whispers, spine quivers, buds swelling, seeds bursting, roots pushing, spores popping, and the vibration of the membrane in the smallest microbe, all coalesced in a great wailing wind, so cohesive in strength and direction that it stops the stone, spins it around, holds it poised in midair, and sets it down, life side up. It was the mighty shout of creation that saved the beautiful world. But we are gambling again with the fate of the earth. The plants, the birds, the salamanders are all trying to make that mighty shout. But we have weakened them to the point that their voices are threadbare and faint, a raspy whisper that can barely be heard over the bulldozers. At this time, they have stood for us, all this time, they have stood for us, and we have paid them with betrayal, with silence, as destruction reigns. And now it is we humans who must give with them the mighty shout. I've tried to imagine what it would sound like to offer my own mighty primal shout for life. As a scientist and as a writer of the beauty of the earth, I had imagined that that shout would sound like a hallelujah chorus. But to my dismay, what arises from my throat instead is a wail of anguish at what we have done. A great cry of shame and a howl of grief for the creation. It surprised me that my shout was a raging no, not a yes of encouragement to the rest of creation. And it scared me at first. But there was wisdom there in understanding that our grief for the earth is the measure of the depth of our love. And love is the material of transformation. Feeling the wounds of the world propels us. In this time, in order to say yes to creation, we have to say no to destruction and resist on behalf of the good green world. And then out of the powerful love we have for the world, raise our voices in the song that will save us. The other beings are waiting to join us in that mighty shout. We remember that the plants have not succumbed to despair. They are growing on the mine waste. They are healing land. They're storing carbon and holding biodiversity. They're making food and medicine and beauty. They give more than they take. They heal the people and heal the earth. Surely we can do the same. And my last thing I would share with you is in one of our songs that speaks of the seventh fire prophecies. The first words of that song are Ambe Mashtara, which means, come on, everybody, let's get going. Now, miigwech, mi'u. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kimmerer, for this extraordinarily generous and deeply resonant presentation. I've been keeping an eye on the comments and the questions as they've been coming in, and they are overwhelming. There are over 1,600 people here today to listen to these words, family, friends, colleagues, Indigenous knowledge keepers, Indigenous community members, and so many others. And I wanted to just draw out a couple of the real strands of conversation that seem to be on people's minds tonight. Speaking to your final section about grief and despair and this moment of extraordinary struggle and uprising. Someone has written revolution. Also a moment when people are writing in from out west, the land is on fire and the smoke is so intense. The question maybe to come from this, how do you not succumb to despair in the face of all that is wrong and that needs to be healed?
Because we know that despair leads us to paralysis. And given the generosity of the earth, the resilience of the earth, I try to be buoyed up and inspired by the lessons of the plants that they have not given up. They are being creative, resilient, courageous, and strong. You know, when I look at plants that are growing up through feet of industrial waste to heal that land, I take that as my charge. I take that as all of our charge. And, you know, I think also that we know that we have tremendous responsibilities in this time when the world is on fire. And when we frame it as responsibilities, it can feel overwhelming and can lead to that paralysis of despair. So one of the things that helps me, as well as an antidote to that despair, is to remember the teaching that we were given that responsibility and gift are two sides of the same coin. That, you know, the thrushes were given that beautiful, beautiful voice. That's their gift. But they also have the responsibility to use that voice to sing us to sleep in the evening. And if we think about what is our responsibility, let's turn that around and say, what is our gift? What is your gift as an individual? And somehow that is more liberating and motivating to say, what is my gift? And how will I give it? And how will I give it to the earth? Because that is what we're called to do in this moment, every last one of us.
Thank you so much for this. I'm going to turn to questions from the audience because there are so many and we will not get to them all, but please know that they're being read and we're trying to surface them. And let me also thank Ali LaForge, who behind the scenes is corralling these questions. The first one of these is from Vic Hogg, who describes themselves as a 24-year-old Potawatomi from Michigan, calling from my new home in Brooklyn, New York. And they ask, what advice do you have for us natives and non-natives living in highly urbanized areas to stay continuously connected to the earth and how it provides for us?
Vic, this question, I'm so glad that you asked this, because it's a question that I really struggle with. As a rural person whose ways of reciprocity with the land are come from living on the land, it takes a real leap of imagination for me to answer the question that you have asked, and I bet it does for you as well, which is what inspires your asking, right? So some of the things that I try to think about is to remember that nature isn't over there. Nature isn't someplace out in the so-called wilderness. It's all nature. There are teachers all around us. That moss in the sidewalk crack is a powerful teacher of lessons of how we might live in urban environments. So I say, look for the teachers around you. They're everywhere. And it comes back to that notion of paying attention, right? And being a student of the other beings who are around you, who have adapted to living in Brooklyn, and would teach us how to do that as well. And one of the practices that I would also share that I have in those times when I'm feeling very disconnected because I am away from my home and my land, and especially when I'm in a city to which I am supremely ill-adapted, is just to take a breath, you know, to take a breath and remember that the air that I'm breathing in, that oxygen was produced by our plant relatives. I'm connected to them with every breath that I take, and I can give my breath back in reciprocity. The last thing I would say about this is that, you know, we think about breath and gratitude as currencies of reciprocity with other beings, but so is currency of energy use and currency of money. So how we spend our energy, how we spend our money are other ways that we can be in reciprocity with the living world. So thank you for that question, and I wish I could answer it more fully, that our urban dwelling relatives can do better.
Thank you. Another question, this one from Nicole, who says, I am an Aquina-Wampanoag student at Amherst College. And Nicole asks, or says, asks, many criticize Indigenous communities' hunt of our animal kin, but fail to recognize that when one being gives their life, our communities give back with care and gratitude. How can we begin to shift the popular belief that not eating any meat, regardless of if the being was hunted with care, is the only sustainable way of living?
Thank you for that very important question, which leads us to that thinking of these two different lenses, right? At looking at the world. And this is the kind of the point of the honorable harvest, right? That when lives are given on our behalf, we have to reciprocate. And that we understand in Potawatomi cosmology that all beings have their original instructions, and they all have gifts and responsibilities. And that one of the gifts and responsibilities from some beings is to feed the others. And that we almost view not eating meat, not accepting that gift that deer or that fish might give to us, as disrespectful. That being is offering us something sacred, and for us to turn our backs on that is disrespectful as well. To honor that, you know, that comes from the fact that we view those animals and the plants as persons, right, with their own responsibilities. If you view the other beings just as objects, as then it's a whole different equation of how we take. But within the Indigenous worldview, we view them as our relatives who are generous with their lives. So thank you for that good question, that chance to shift the lens a bit on the gifts of other beings.
Thank you. We have many questions from students and teachers and all of us who are still learning so much. And I wanted to share one from Marina, who's an environmental science teacher that was also asked in a different form by Emma, an English teacher. Question, I'm an environmental science teacher in a public school. I'm tied to a curriculum that, like the prevailing view in the US, emphasizes natural resources, ecosystem services, and the view of the environment as separate from humanity. Do you have any advice for how I can incorporate Indigenous knowledge into my class?
Yeah, I share your frustration of being fully embedded in the Western scientific worldview, right? And you know, I want to say at the outset that I'm a scientist, and there's a lot that I love about Western science. What I don't love is scientism. Scientism being that idea that science is the only way to understand the world, right? Um, and to me, the antidote to these kinds of mandates for that narrow sort of education is the medicine wheel, that conceptual model that I showed a slide of that says, we human people have at least 4 ways of knowing: mind, body, emotion, and spirit. And oftentimes the way that environmental science is taught is only thinking about the intellect and the body, you know, the biophysical. And we do ourselves a disservice if we cut ourselves off from emotional intelligence and spiritual knowledge. Those are where we incorporate our values into environmental science. Western science isn't designed to deal with values. It explicitly excludes them for good reason. So the medicine wheel and Indigenous ways of knowing are Western science, or Western science is just a subset of Indigenous knowledge. So I introduced that model of these 4 ways of knowing at the beginnings of my class, and to say, we're going to use all of them because each of them are tools that can bring us to different understanding and different relationship. A lot of environmental science education, as you probably know, is moving away from that strictly biophysical education, because we used to think that, you know, if people only knew how the food chain works, they'd protect it. Well, that isn't true. It's not enough to know, you have to care. And that's where emotion and spirit come into play, and the arts, of course.
We have a number of questions that pick up on some of what you are talking about, navigating different spaces, different ways of knowing that come together, but sometimes also collide. And so I will share a question from Kay. Kay says, as someone who is also struggling as a Métis woman navigating academia, what would you recommend to my fellow Indigenous grad students seeking to change the institutions that we exist in while navigating imposter syndrome, re-traumatization from colonial traumas, and removal from community? What medicines should we as students, as well as educators, carry with us in our day-to-day?
What a beautiful question. And with that question, you have united so many of us who are carrying that burden and who are walking that path, which is so difficult. I think one of the things that I would say about that as a source of strength is to know that you're not walking that path alone. Not only is there a whole new generation of Indigenous scholars, but our ancestors are walking beside us. You know, all of our teachings, the teachings of the seventh fire. We are picking all of those things up and carrying them into the future, and that helps me put one foot in front of the next. It also means that, in my experience, the importance of being generous and clear with our teachings about Indigenous worldview, to open up our colleagues' eyes to multiple ways of knowing. They've been raised in an educational monoculture of the Western worldview. And in many cases, they are ignorant of other ways of knowing. And so what I try to do is to say, they often think of it as a binary, right? Of the binaries of Western dualism, of one thing or the other. Whereas what I try to talk about is science and Indigenous knowledge, that both of these together can give us so many more insights and relationships and creativity in the work ahead. So one of those is an answer to share with your colleagues, and I suppose the other is the one to keep us all walking hand in hand.
Related to this, a question from Karen, who is an interdisciplinary artist who's interested in endangered languages. Karen asks, do you feel that learning Indigenous languages would help us to think differently about the land and to listen to plants differently? Has your multilingualism helped you to think about land and nature in more ecological ways?
The answer to that is yes, 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 yes. Learning, I'm just a beginner in learning my language. What I find is that in our language are the reframing of so many ideas, that learning a language, as you know, is not just learning vocabulary, right? It's learning the concepts which underpin the language. And in Braiding Sweetgrass and in elsewhere, I've written about one of the most important elements of that for me that I do encourage people to share and to learn about is that in many Indigenous languages, we speak a grammar of animacy. That in Indigenous languages, well, let me back up and remind us that in English, how do we talk about maple trees and bluebirds and goldenrod and monarch butterflies? We call them it. English language allows us to speak of our fellow humans as family, but everybody else gets called an it. And if that doesn't encapsulate the teachings, the principles of human exceptionalism, I don't know what does. But in answer to your question of what could we learn by learning Indigenous languages, we could learn about the personhood of other beings, because it is impossible to speak about the living world as anything other than our family and our relatives in Indigenous languages. So that's just one small example of the way in which your worldview, your whole way of being and understanding the world gets shaken to its core when you learn another language.
Related to this, there's a question that has come in from Anonymous, make sure I'm not muted here, who says, I love what you offered earlier, that corporations are often offered personhood, but living beings are not. Can you elaborate on this and your definition of personhood? You use the phrase, the right to exist. Is this the core of your definition of personhood?
Oh, wow. We could talk all night about what personhood means to me. But I think what I want to invoke at this particular moment is the rights of nature movement, because the rights of nature movement is this new form of jurisprudence that comes at law from the assumption of personhood of living beings, and suggest that they do have a right to exist, to reproduce, to carry on in the world, and that we should not be infringing on that right for other beings. What do I mean by personhood? Again, there's so much to say about that, but to me, a person is a being with their own gifts, their own responsibilities, their own intentions in the world, their own particular kind of intelligence. Not human kind of intelligence, but maple kind of intelligence. A person is a being who is capable of reciprocity with the world. So that's what I mean by a person. Very different than the Western legal definition or grammatical definition of a person.
We have several questions that are about how to relate to a world that is dramatically changing. And so I'll try to pull together two of these. The first part of this from Marguerite, who's a graduate history student who studies the shifting roles of horticulture in human lives. Marguerite asks, how do we negotiate the eventual loss of native species that have cultural importance? How do we continue to tell those stories without the touchstones? And I think related to this, a question from another listener about what Indigenous teachings might have to say to us about ways of dealing with invasive species and those lives that are new to an area.
Yeah, I suppose, let me answer that second question first. Because again, as a plant ecologist, I am exquisitely sensitive to the impacts of so-called invasive species. And I joke that while I'm pulling garlic mustard in the woods, I have a lot of time to think about this. And what do I mean by that? I do take very seriously this notion of plants as persons, as wise persons, as teachers. And so I reject the notion that just because a species came from somewhere else, and they didn't come on their own, we brought them, that they are somehow bad. It's a very interesting sociological and ethical concept that has ramifications in other parts of our world. It comes from someplace else, it must be bad. Which is not to say that Phragmites, for example, a terrible wetland invasive species, doesn't do damage, but we have put so much nitrogen and phosphorus into our water that our native cattails can't take it up. Phragmites can. So maybe we think, well, what are these plants doing here? Why have they come here? What are their gifts and their responsibilities? And how might we embrace them rather than try immediately to eradicate them, which is not to say we don't need to protect our native plants from being outcompeted by non-native plants. That's what I say to the garlic mustard. I say, you can have the ditches, you can have the edges all you want. I don't hate you. I don't want to make you go extinct, but you may not live in my trillium woods. So it's a matter of balance and trying to learn more about those species. The first part of the question, of course, was about what do we do when native species are gone, when they are touchstones for us? Cultural keystone species, we call those, right? Species that are so important to human and also to more than human cultures. And to me, one of the important things is ecological restoration, that we embrace these scientific and cultural tools of restoration to help those plants, to help them particularly in the face of climate change with assisted migration. Just as our people always did, they always were moving the plants around in order to aid them in being where they needed to be.
Thank you for that. There's a series of questions about needs for new economic, social, political models to bring us to the types of places that you are describing. So I'll take one or two of these here. Carl asks, how do you respond to the common mindset that environmental conservation and achieving socioeconomic equality must be balanced, that they cannot be pursued together or that they are mutually exclusive? And I think related to this, there's a question from M who says, I'd love to hear you speak more about the topic you touch on when buying a pen and paper in Braiding Sweetgrass. How do you grapple with daily participation in racial capitalism, which most of us cannot escape? How do you choose what a good choice is when so many things hurt Earth and people?
These are the questions of Seventh Fire people, for sure. And I honor these questions and don't pretend that I have all the answers to those at all. I think that for me, the answer to this question of navigating complicity with complicit participation in capitalism is to live as simply as possible, to take as little as you can, and to try to shift the model from scarcity to abundance. We know that capitalism and market economies, particularly the extractive economies that are so damaging, really come, first of all, from the objectification and commodification of nature. So coming to think about living beings as opposed to stuff and property is one antidote to that. And also to try to foster gift economies, local economies that rely on a currency of reciprocal relationship rather than strictly on the market economy. There's so many dimensions to that. I'm sorry, I can't touch on all of them, but it's a really profound question that each of us has. Oh, I know where I was also going with that. Scarcity and abundance, that in a gift economy and an economy based on gratitude for what you have, it's a call to sharing. In a gift economy, and the more we do of that, the more we can free ourselves from the market economy, but not completely. We need an economic revolution.
I hope that as people are listening to this, right, that people feel inclined to join us for continuing conversation in a little bit, because this is clearly a multifaceted set of issues, and you're doing so much to help us begin this reorientation. We have time for a couple more questions. So I want to share two from Indigenous community members who are asking about both academia and young people, because I think these are topics that may be on a lot of people's minds. The first of these is from Kiara, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who's Nez Perce, who is one of your mentees. She says hello.
Yes,
and asked this, she says, I am curious and hoping to talk and write about how we, as Indigenous scholars, balance the academic life with our cultural and lived experiences. How do you balance the platform and knowledge you have been given while still continuing our cultural doings, responsibilities, etc.?
I think the answer that I would have to that is, of course, the striking of a balance between our responsibilities to those different arenas, which are oftentimes in conflict with one another. And with the guidance that the balance for me, the balance that I seek between cultural participation, between studying my language and gathering plants and doing ceremony, that I prioritize those things in balance with my responsibilities as a professor and a writer, and that balance doesn't come every single day. And I have come to sort of accept the imbalance that I have to live with at some times. And then I close the door on that Western way and say, these are the days that I'm giving myself over to cultural practice. I will also say that one of the ways that I try to fit it in is some guidance that was given me by, maybe you've been to like the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Summit. We were given the guidance there to say, well, of course, this balance between indigenous foodways and dominant society foodways, for example, is very difficult to create. So make yourself a commitment to every single day take into your body some of your indigenous foods that you have grown or been gifted with or gathered on the land, even if it's just one bite. And I take that and use it as a metaphor for all sorts of cultural practice. When I feel swamped by the academic life, I'll say, yeah, but I'm always going to go out in the morning and give my gratitude and put down my sema. It's my one bite a day. So I would say it's a hard balance. It's really hard and dynamic for sure.
Perhaps related to this, a really beautiful question from a young Anishinaabe Kwe who says, Miigwech, what guidance do you have for younger Anishinaabe Kweyak? What would you tell your 16-year-old self, if you could, about our gift and role as Kwe, if I'm pronouncing that correctly?
Oh, miigwech for that beautiful, beautiful question. I have to tell you that my 16-year-old self, I want to lecture her from this position as a grandmother. And when I see 16-year-old Kwe, when I see my wonderful, brilliant Indigenous students, I am so grateful that they are not the young woman that I was. I was quiet. I tried to fly under the radar. I knew that the ways that I thought were precious to me and could not be understood by the people who were around me. So I kept them to myself. And that's what I would say to my 16-year-old self. You have a voice and use it. And I'm so grateful to the rising voices of young Indigenous women who are fearlessly challenging the status quo and taking on a decolonizing project and the project of participating in the renewal and revitalization of our cultures. And so I say miigwech, chi miigwech to all of you, and wag my finger at my 16-year-old self for her silence.
We probably have time for one or two more questions, and I'm looking at a couple that have just come in. This is a question from Margaret, who writes, as a white person, I am concerned that in passing along what I've learned from you and other Indigenous peoples, I am engaging in cultural appropriation. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Sure. And there's a real parallel to how we share knowledge in academia as well. I have been told by many of my most revered Anishinaabe teachers that knowledge is powerful only when it is shared, but that knowledge is coupled to responsibility. So you share it in such a way that responsibility for the knowledge goes along with the knowledge. I think that's pretty good guidance to have. And the way that we couple part of the responsibility for that knowledge is the genealogy or the lineage of that knowledge, to always say where you got a story from. I heard this story from Tommy Porter. You know, I heard this song from someone else. We do that in academic writing, right? We cite one another. And so that's very important to acknowledge the sources of the knowledge that has been shared, and to know that in Indigenous ways of thinking, that knowledge and responsibility are so tightly coupled, and please don't take them apart.
That is an extremely important note, I think, to end the questions on. I did want to ask Dr. Kimmerer if you have any concluding thoughts that you wanted to share before we wrap things up formally this evening.
I think the story that a very short story that I would want to share in closing comes from an interaction with a young woman scientist who, when she was graduating, she was one of my beloved students, and when she was graduating into a career in environmental science and activism, I felt that I needed to apologize to her, saying, you know, here you are going off into the world to be an environmental scientist, and I was part of Earth Day, original Earth Day, many long years ago, and I never would have dreamed that you know, 50 years later, you would be fighting the same battles. I thought we would have had this figured out, and I apologized to her that we didn't. And I felt really bad about it. And as is so often, the student became the teacher, and she said to me, Dr. Kimmerer, don't you realize that this is the best possible time to be alive? And I thought, really? This moment? And she said, oh yeah, you know, back to your precipice metaphor of your whole series. She said, it's like a teeter-totter. If you have this teeter-totter, this board, you know, on tippy on the precipice, that it matters where you stand. the fate matters where I stand. She said, how wonderful to be alive in a moment when my life has meaning, when every decision that I make, what I buy, what I say, how I vote, what I do with my gifts and responsibility makes an incredible difference in the future of life. And I was so grateful for her perspective, because a purpose-driven life is a life imbued with sacred energy, and she was exactly right.
I'm pretty speechless about what to say to that, and so I will just express gratitude on behalf of everyone who has tuned in this evening for the words you have shared and the stories. I wanted to say a brief note to folks who are still here. Everyone is warmly invited to join discussion groups that are hosted by several of the co-sponsors of this event, so the conversations can continue. If you wish to do that, please take a look down in the chat in the Zoom and click the Zoom link corresponding to the first letter of your first name. You'll then be directed to a new Zoom room and the conversation can go on from there. But perhaps we all might virtually take a moment to thank Dr. Kimmerer for her time and her extraordinary generosity. Thank you.